Well, hello there, and welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. In each episode, we'll read about 30 minutes of a history book. We are in Chapter 19 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, reading about the Native American Civil Rights Movement in the early 70s. Just finished talking about prison riots. I'm not sure. Maybe we're going to finish the chapter tonight. Maybe we're not. I don't know. Why don't you pour yourself a cup of cocoa and join me? Let's dig in. In the fall of 1970, a magazine called La Raza, one of the countless local publications coming out of the movements of those early years to supply information ignored in the regular media, told about the Pit River Indians of Northern California. 60 Pit Indians occupied land they said belonged to them. They defied the Forest Services when ordered to leave. One of them, Darrell B. Wilson, later recalled, "As the flames danced orange, making the trees come to life, and the cold creeped out of the darkness to challenge the speaking fire, and our breath came in small clouds, we spoke." They asked the government by what treaty it claimed the land. It could point to none. They cited a federal statute, and there's a notification here, citation 25 USCA 194, if you want to look that up, that where there was a land dispute between Indian and white, the burden of proof falls on the white man. They had built a Quonset hut, and the marshals told them it was ugly and ruined the landscape. Ruined the landscape. I can speak really. Wilson wrote later, "The whole world is rotting. The water is poisoned, the air polluted, the politics deformed, the land gutted, the forest pillaged, the shores ruined, the towns burned, the lives of the people destroyed. And the Federals spent the best part of October trying to tell us the Quonset hut was ugly. To us it was beautiful. It was the beginning of our school, the meeting place, home for our homeless, a sanctuary for those needing rest, our church, our headquarters, our business office, our symbol of approaching freedom, and it still stands. It was also the center for the reviving of our stricken, diluted, and separated culture, our beginning. It was our sun rising on a clear spring day when the sky holds no clouds. It was a good and pure thing for the heart to look upon. That small place on earth. Our place. Well, not my place. But 150 marshals came with machine guns, shotguns, rifles, pistols, riot sticks, mace, dogs, chains, manacles. The old people were frightened. The young questioned bravery. The small children were like a deer that has been shot by the thunderstick. Hearts beat fast as though a race was just run in the heat of summer. The marshals began swinging their riot sticks, and blood started flowing. Wilson grabbed one marshal's club, was thrown down, manacled, and while lying face down on the ground, was struck behind the head several times. A 66-year-old man was beaten into unconsciousness. A white reporter was arrested, his wife beaten. Now, why would a reporter's wife be there? They were all thrown into trucks and taken away, charged with assaulting state and federal officers and cutting trees, but not with trespassing, which might have brought into question the ownership of the land. When the episode was all over, they were still defiant. Indians who had been in the Vietnam War made connections at the Winter Soldier investigations in Detroit, where Vietnam veterans testified about their experiences. An Oklahoma Indian named Evan Haney told about his. The same massacres happened to the Indians 100 years ago. Germ warfare was used then. They put smallpox in the Indians' blankets. I got to know the Vietnamese people and I learned they were just like us. What we are doing is destroying ourselves and the world. I have grown up with racism all my life. When I was a child watching cowboys and Indians on TV, I would root for the cavalry, not the Indians. It was that bad. I was that far toward my own destruction. Though 50% of the children at the country school I attended in Oklahoma were Indians, nothing in school, on television, or on the radio taught anything about Indian culture. There were no books on Indian history, not even in the library. But I knew something was wrong. I started reading and learning my own culture. I saw the Indian people at their happiest when they went to Alcatraz or to Washington to defend their fishing rights. They at last felt like human beings. Indians began to do something about their own destruction, the annihilation of their culture. In 1969, at the first convocation of American Indian scholars, Indians spoke indignantly of either the ignoring or the insulting of Indians in textbooks given to little children all over the United States. That year, the Indian Historian Press was founded. It evaluated 400 textbooks in elementary and secondary schools and found that not one of them gave an accurate depiction of the Indian. A counterattack began in the schools. In early 1971, 45 Indian students at Copper Valley School in Glen Allen, Alaska, wrote a letter to their congressman opposing the Alaska oil pipeline as ruinous to the ecology, a threat to the peace, quiet, and security of our Alaska. Other Americans were beginning to pay attention, to rethink their own learning. The first motion pictures attempting to redress the history of the Indian appeared. One was Little Big Man, based on a novel by Thomas Berger. More and more books appeared on Indian history until a whole new literature came into existence. Teachers became sensitive to the old stereotypes, threw away the old textbooks, started using new material. In the spring 1977, a teacher named Jane Califf in the New York City elementary schools told of her experiences with 4th and 5th grade students. She brought into class the traditional textbooks and asked the students to locate the stereotypes in them. She read aloud from Native American writers and articles from Akwesasne notes and put protest posters around the room. The children then wrote letters to the editors of the books they had read. Dear editor, I don't like your book called The Cruise of Christopher Columbus. I didn't like it because you said some things about Indians that weren't true. Another thing I didn't like was on page 69, it says that Christopher Columbus invited the Indians to Spain, but what really happened was that he stole them. Sincerely, Raymond Miranda. Sincerely spelled Censearly. This is just darling. On Thanksgiving Day, 1970, at the annual celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims, the authorities decided to do something different. Invite an Indian to make the celebratory speech. They found a Wampanoag Indian named Frank James and asked him to speak. But when they saw the speech he was about to deliver, they decided they did not want it. His speech, not heard at Plymouth, Massachusetts on that occasion, said in part, the whole speech is in Chronicles of American Indian Protest. I speak to you as a man, a Wampanoag man. It is with mixed emotions that I stand here to share my thoughts. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn, wheat, and beans. Our spirit refuses to die. Yesterday we walked the woodland paths and sandy trails. Today we must walk the macadam highways and roads. We are uniting. We're standing not in our wigwams, but in your concrete tent. We stand tall and proud, and before too many moons pass, we'll right the wrongs we have allowed to happen to us. For Indians, there has never been a clear line between prose and poetry. When an Indian studying in New Mexico was praised for his poetry, he said, "In my tribe we have no poets. Everyone talks in poetry. There are, however," well, this is not him talking about it. "There are, however, poems collected in William Brandon's The Last Americans and in The Way by Shirley Hill, Witt, and Stan Steiner. An Anishinaabe spring poem, translated by Gerald Vizenor. As my eyes look across the prairie, I feel the summer and the spring." Snow the Last by Joseph Concha. Snow comes last, for it quiets down everything. This from a fifth-year group in a special Navajo program in the year 1940 called "It Is Not!" exclamation point. The Navajo Reservation a lonesome place? It is not. The skies are sunny, clear blue or gray with rain. Each day is gay in nature's way. It is not a lonesome place at all. A Navajo house shabby and small? It is not. Inside there's love, good laughter and big talk, but best, it's home. With an open door and room for all, a castle could have no more. I like that. In March of 1973 came a powerful affirmation that the Indians of North America were still alive. On the site of the 1890 massacre on Pine Ridge Reservation, several hundred Oglala Sioux and friends returned to the village of Wounded Knee to occupy it as a symbol of the demand for Indian land, Indian rights. The history of that event, in the words of the participants, had been captured in a rare book published by Akwesasne Notes. In the 1970s, 54% of the adult males on the Pine Ridge Reservation were unemployed. 1/3 of the families were on welfare or pensions. Alcoholism was widespread and suicide rates were high. The life expectancy of an Oglala Sioux was 46 years. For the record, I'm older than that now. Just before the Wounded Knee occupation, there was violence at the town of Custer. An Indian named Wesley Badheart Bull was killed by a white gas station attendant. The man was let out on $5,000 bond and indicted for manslaughter, facing a possible 10-year term. A gathering of Indians to protest this led to a clash with police. The murder victim's mother, Mrs. Sarah Badheart Bull, was arrested on charges that called for a maximum sentence of 30 years. What was she arrested for? On February 27th, 1973, about 300 Oglala Sioux, many of them members of the new militant organization called the American Indian Movement, or AIM, AIM, entered the village of Wounded Knee and declared it liberated territory. Ellen Move's camp later said, "We decided that we did need the American Indian movement in here because our men were scared. They hung to the back. It was mostly the women that went forward and spoke out." Within hours, more than 200 FBI agents, federal marshals, and police of the Bureau of Indian Affairs surrounded and blockaded the town. They had armored vehicles, automatic rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers, and gas shells, and soon began firing. Gladys Bissonnette said 3 weeks later, "Since we are here in Wounded Knee, we've been shot at over and over, always after dark. But last night we were hit the hardest. I guess the Great Spirit is with us, and no bullets find their way into our bodies. We ran through a hail of bullets one night. We're going to hold our stand until we are completely an independent sovereign nation, Oglala Sioux Nation. After the siege began, food supplies became short. Indians in Michigan sent food via a plane that landed inside the encampment. The next day, FBI agents arrested the pilot and a doctor from Michigan who had hired the plane. In Nevada, 11 Indians were arrested for taking food, clothing, and medical supplies in South Dakota. In mid-April, 3 more planes dropped 1,200 pounds of food. But as people scrambled to gather it up, a government helicopter appeared overhead and fired down on them while ground fire came from all sides. Frank Clearwater, an Indian man lying on a cot inside a church, was hit by a bullet. When his wife accompanied him to a hospital, she was arrested and jailed. Clearwater died. There were more gun battles. Another death. Finally, a negotiated peace was signed, in which both sides agreed to disarm. The Indians had refused to disarm while surrounded by armed men, recalling the 1890 massacre. The United States government promised to investigate Indian affairs, and a presidential commission would re-examine the 1868 treaty. The siege ended, and 120 occupiers were arrested. The U.S. government said that it had re-examined the 1868 treaty, found it valid, but that it was superseded by the U.S. power of eminent domain, a government's power to take land. The Indians had held out for 71 days, creating a marvelous community inside the besieged territory. Communal kitchens were set up, a health clinic, and a hospital. A Navajo Vietnam veteran said, "There's a tremendous amount of coolness considering that we're outgunned, but people stay because they believe. They have a cause. That's why we lost in Vietnam, because there was no cause. We were fighting a rich man's war for the rich man. In Wounded Knee, we're doing pretty damn good, morale-wise, because we can still laugh." Messages of support had come to Wounded Knee from Australia, Finland, Germany, Italy, Japan, and England. One message came from some of the Attica brothers, 2 of whom were Indians. "You fight for our Earth Mother and her children. Our spirit fights with you," Wallace Black Elk replied. "Little Wounded Knee is turned into a giant world." After Wounded Knee, in spite of the deaths, the trials, the use of the police and courts to try to break the movement, the Native American movement continued. In the Akwesasne community itself, which put out Akwesasne Notes, the Indians had always insisted their territory was separate, not to be invaded by the white man's law. One day, New York State Police gave 3 traffic tickets to a Mohawk Indian truck driver, and a council of Indians met with the police lieutenant. At first, he insisted that he had to follow orders and give out tickets even in Akwesasne territory, although he obviously was trying to be reasonable. He finally agreed that they would not arrest an Indian in the territory or even outside of it without first having a meeting with the Mohawk Council. The lieutenant then sat down and lit a cigar. Indian Chief I'm not going to pronounce this right, and I apologize. Indian Chief Jawakwaso, a distinguished-looking man with long hair, rose and addressed the lieutenant with a serious voice. "There is one more thing before you go," he said, looking straight at the lieutenant. "I want to know," he said slowly, "if you've got an extra cigar." The meeting ended in laughter. Thanks, Howard Zinn, for putting this in a history book. Akwesasne Notes continued to publish. On its poetry page, late autumn 1976, appeared poems reflecting the spirit of the times. Ella Abernathy wrote, I am grass growing in the shearer of grass. I am the willow and the splitter of lathes. Weaver and the thing woven, marriage of willow and grass. I am frost on the land and the land's life, breath and beast and the sharp rock underfoot. In me the mountain lives and the owl strikes, and I in them. I am the sun's twin, mover of blood and the blood lost. I am the deer and the deer's death. I am the burr in your conscience. Acknowledge me. Conscience, acknowledge me. And Buffy St. Marie, you think I have visions because I am an Indian? I have visions because there are visions to be seen. My parents used to have some of her albums. In the 60s and 70s, it was not just a women's movement, a prisoners' movement, an Indian movement. There was general revolt against oppressive, artificial, previously unquestioned ways of living. It touched every aspect of personal life. Childbirth, childhood, love, sex, marriage, dress, music, art, sports, language, food, housing, religion, literature, death, schools. That's a lot. The new temper, the new behavior shocked many Americans. It created tensions. Sometimes it was seen as a generation gap, the younger generation moving far away from the older one in its way of life, but it seemed after a while to be not so much a matter of age. Some young people remained straight, while some middle-aged people were changing their ways, and old people were beginning to behave in ways that astounded others. Sexual behavior went through startling changes. Premarital sex was no longer a matter for silence. Men and women lived together outside of marriage and struggled for words to describe the other person when introduced. I want you to meet my friend. Married couples candidly spoke of their affairs, and books appeared discussing open marriage. Masturbation could be talked about openly, even approvingly. Homosexuality was no longer concealed. Gay men and gay women, lesbians, organized to combat discrimination against them, to give themselves a sense of community, to overcome shame and isolation. All this was reflected in the literature and in the mass media. Court decisions overruled the local banning of books that were erotic or even pornographic. A new literature appeared, The Joy of Sex and others, to teach men and women how sexual fulfillment could be attained. The movies now did not hesitate to show nudity, although the motion picture industry, wanting to preserve principle as well as profit, set up a classification system. R for restricted, X for prohibited to children. The language of sex became more common both in literature and in ordinary conversation. I was just remembering how on the old Dick Van Dyke reruns, they had to have separate beds, and they always had to have their foot on the floor while they were filming. They always had to have one foot on the floor. They could have one foot up, but always had to have one foot on the floor. It's really interesting how society just changed. All this was connected with new living arrangements. Especially among young people, communal living arrangements flourished. A few were truly communes, that is, based on the sharing of money and decisions, creating a community of intimacy, affection, trust. Most were practical arrangements for sharing the rent, with varying degrees of friendship and intimate association among the participants. It was no longer unusual for men and women to be roommates, in groups of 2 or 3 or larger, and without sexual relations, as practical, unself-conscious arrangements. The most important thing about dress in the cultural change of the 60s was the greater informality. For women, it was a continuation of the historic feminist movement's insistence on discarding of feminine, hampering clothes. Many women stopped wearing bras. The restrictive girdle, almost a uniform of the 40s and 50s, became rare. Young men and women dressed more nearly alike, in jeans, in discarded army uniforms. Men stopped wearing neckties. Women of all ages wore pants more often. Unspoken homage to Amelia Bloomer. There was a new popular music of protest. Pete Seeger had been singing protest songs since the 40s, but now he came into his own. His audience is much larger. Bob Dylan and Joan Baez singing not only protest songs, but songs reflecting the new abandon, the new culture, became popular idols. A middle-aged woman on the West Coast, Malvina Reynolds, wrote and sang songs that fit her socialist thinking and her libertarian spirit, as well as her critique of the modern commercial culture. Everybody now, she sang, lived in little boxes, and they all came out just the same. Bob Dylan was a phenomenon unto himself. Powerful songs of protest, personal songs of freedom and self-expression. In an angry song, Masters of War, he hopes that one day they will all die and he will follow their casket into the pale afternoon. A Hard Day's a Gonna Fall recounts the terrible stories of the last decades of starvation and war and tears and dead ponies and poisoned waters and damp, dirty prisons. It's a hard rain's a gonna fall, Dylan sang, a bitter anti-war song. It'd be better if I knew how the song went. I don't know that one. With God on our side is one, and one about the killer of the black activist Medgar Evers, only a pawn in their game. He offered a challenge to the old, hope to the new, for the times they are a-changin'. See, I know that one. The Catholic upsurge against the war was part of a general revolt inside the Catholic Church, which had for so long been a bulwark of conservatism, tied to racism, jingoism, war. Priests and nuns resigned from the church, opened their lives to sex, got married and had children, sometimes without bothering to leave the church officially. True, there was still enormous popularity for the old-time religious revivalists, and Billy Graham commanded the obedience of millions, but now there were small, swift currents against the mainstream. There was a new suspicion of big business, of profiteering as the motive for ruining the environment. You think? There was a re-examination of the death industry, of money-making funerals and profitable tombstones, as in Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death. With the loss of faith in big powers, business, government, religion, there arose a stronger belief in self, whether individual or collective. The experts in all fields were now looked at skeptically. The belief grew that people could figure out for themselves what to eat, how to live their lives, how to be healthy. There was suspicion of the medical industry and campaigns against chemical preservatives, valueless foods, advertising. By now, the scientific evidence of the evils of smoking, cancer, heart disease was so powerful that the government barred advertising of cigarettes on television and in newspapers. Traditional education began to be re-examined. The schools had taught whole generations the values of patriotism, of obeying authority, and had perpetuated ignorance, even contempt for people of other nations, races, Native Americans, women. Funny how Native Americans is not included in races. But okay. Not just the content of education was challenged, but the style. the formality, the bureaucracy, the insistence on subordination to authority. This made only a small dent in the formidable national system of Orthodox education, but it was reflected in a new generation of teachers all over the country, and a new literature to sustain them. Jonathan Kozol, who wrote Death at an Early Age, and George Dennison, The Lives of Children, Ivan Illich, Deschooling Society. Never in American history had more movements for change been concentrated into so short a span of years. But the system, in the course of 2 centuries, had learned a good deal about the control of people. In the mid-70s, that system went to work. And we did finish the chapter, and it wasn't even a whole half-hour episode. So, it's a little short, but you're watching it free, so that's good. Thank you for joining me. Join me next time. Hit that like and subscribe button, the notification bell, because YouTube does unsubscribe people, and I just might fall into that category. It is possible. C'est possible. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. I'm out.